Hi, and welcome to our first episode of Season 2 of the Connection Timeout podcast. I'm joined today by Matthew Byrne, who's the Director of IT at St. Monica's College, and our Education Relationship Manager, Simon Shenton. We're going to be focusing on cybersecurity in education this episode, and why you should be listening is because we're going to be touching on some key topics around the threats that are going to be impacting schools and why schools should be investing in cybersecurity, both training their users and protecting the student and the parents' personal identifiable information. But we're also going to be broadening out that conversation to what some of the things that you can apply in the schools for very minimal investment and some of the low-hanging fruit that you might have access to today. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to presenting future episodes both in video and audio format. So before I launch you to the questions, Matt, for the benefit of our audience, we'd love for you to be able to give us a bit of an introduction and your experience in IT, but also how it relates to the education space.
Yeah, thank you. So my role here at St. Monica's is the Director of Information Technology, and I've been doing this role for about 3 months now. Prior to that, I've had an experience in the education sector for 11 years at this school as well. With a number of varied roles. I started as the school's notebook program coordinator in a one-to-one program that was offered by the school, then moved into a systems administration role, then the manager of information technology, deputy director of information technology, and then now director of information technology. So I've progressed through the school and seen it change and the IT industry change in education over the last 11 years. My background is predominantly in systems administration. At university, I studied a Bachelor of Information Technology and Systems Administration, and I've also done industry certifications around Cisco, CCNA. I've done the ITIL certifications and a few others. So I have hands-on experience as being a systems administrator and engineer as well, along with the management experience. So hopefully I can bring a bit to this discussion.
I was going to say, Matt, you definitely meet the qualifications brief.
Just a bit.
I think we did a really good job getting you on here today. So thank you so much for that. And we're also joined by Simon Shenton, our very own Education Relationship Manager at CT. So Simon, welcome. You're making your debut on the podcast.
I am. Yeah, I'm looking forward to completely destroying everything you've worked with. So enjoying it very much.
And I might add, for those IT professionals in education that wouldn't have maybe known about you 12 months ago, but I think you've done an amazing job over the last 6 months getting your name and your brand out there.
Thank you.
I'd just like to apologise on Simon's behalf and our behalf that, for all the phone calls and the emails that you might have been receiving for him, but thank you so much for embracing him as part of your community.
No, thank you. No, it's been really interesting coming over from the UK, doing a similar sort of thing over there, and then coming here and finding out that there are a lot of challenges very similar. But there's also a lot of new and exciting challenges. And, as you indicated there, it's been lovely how welcoming the community has been over here. So I'm really enjoying it.
Awesome. All right, let's launch into the questions. So technology is continuing to play more of a role in how we educate, and it's getting more and more into the hands of the users. How is that reshaping how we manage cybersecurity at school? So I might launch into your opinion first here, Matt, please.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. So I suppose where cybersecurity comes in how we manage cybersecurity in schools, now that technology is playing more of a role, is we're seeing trends where schools are now collecting more data than ever, particularly in their student administration and student management systems. And that could be data from medical information to legal information. Of course, there's academic results and pastoral information such as counselling and other areas. And so it's really critical that schools now take seriously cybersecurity and invest in the appropriate technology and skills to help defend and protect their systems. Another element of this is to ensure that your user training is also up to scratch to make sure that the data is being handled appropriately and that it's being stored safely in secure systems as well. So there's elements of having the appropriate infrastructure and technology in place to protect that data, but also having the users aware where the data should be kept, how they should handle it, and how they should manage it and treat it properly. So I suppose privacy is another area, adhering by the Australian government privacy guidelines and things like that to make sure that you're conscious of where you're housing your data as schools. And these sort of discussions should be at forefront of any conversation around implementation of systems, or if you're hosting a new set of data somewhere, where is it being kept, how are you keeping it, is it encrypted? Those sort of things are really paramount to managing cybersecurity in consideration of all the data that's being kept these days.
I might stay with you if I can, Matt, because I think I want to expand on that question just a little bit further. How have you noticed over the last, let's call it two years or so, the conversation happening at leadership level? Are you finding that the principal and DPs and maybe even the business managers are now coming to you and asking for direction in this, or are you sort of still finding that you're having to push that up from IT?
I think there's elements of both there. I think there's sides from IT around discussions such as multi-factor authentication and other systems that we certainly raise with leadership because they're not IT professionals, so they're not aware of the best practices in the industry of what should be being implemented. But certainly we are being approached by leadership and other areas and even external providers about what are our requirements. So as you see, cybersecurity insurance companies are sort of having almost a shopping list of requirements these days of what you should be doing. Otherwise, you may or may not be covered. There's also bodies such as the Melbourne Archdiocese Catholic Schools and government bodies that may be mandating certain requirements. And also, there's just a general sense in the community of protecting data. I suppose in the last 2 years, we've had not only COVID, and so a lot of workflow has moved online from old processes that may have been paper-based where people didn't think about these things. But then there's also been those high-profile cases in the media, such as the Optus and Medibank ones recently, where all of a sudden the whole notion of taking user data seriously and where it's kept and how secure it is in the forefront of almost every person in Australia's mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So to you, Simon, now, what are you hearing now? You're obviously having a much broader conversation across a number of other schools, both Catholic, independent. What are you hearing out there?
Well, just to, if I may, just to add a quick section on what we were talking about with Matthew there, where, whether it's coming from above or from kind of being pushed up. What I'm hearing from quite a lot of schools that we're doing kind of assessments with, so we're working with schools looking to understand what their current position is and how they're currently performing. And a lot of that comes under the risk and compliance. And a lot of that is being driven by board members at school, which is quite interesting. So it goes beyond the principal, for want of a better term. So they're looking to explore from a risk and compliance perspective how they can ensure that they're being as effective as possible. I said, especially with those breaches that you were just talking about, Matthew. I mean, I think the other aspect is when you have a couple of schools, especially where parent credit card details are kept, that really highlights some big issues. So boards are very nervous now around that. So we are seeing a lot of boards asking around how protected they are, and that then leads into a much broader conversation around risk and compliance. So how that data is stored and how it's processed.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear both your opinions on this particular question. I'll start with you though, Matt. Can you materialize for maybe the non-technology people that might be listening today? Can you materialize for us the actual risk for the schools?
Thanks, Dom. I suppose I'll start with what sort of data, and then I'll go into what risk there is to the school. In terms of data, there's some sensitive data with schools in particular around legal cases, things like court orders that need to be kept on student management systems, where, for example, a parent or guardian may not be allowed to be contacted, and that data is in those systems now. Should that data be leaked to the wrong people, that can open up the school to some legal liability there. There's also sensitive information around psychology or counselling in schools, along with medical records that can be kept. Obviously, if they fell into the wrong hands, that could have flow-on implications to who knows about these conditions and so on and so forth. There's also addresses, contact addresses, phone numbers. If they were to be leaked, you could open up people to a risk of privacy invasion there, or even things like spamming of email addresses or phishing to email addresses and phone numbers. They're at risk. From the school's point of view, I suppose it's the risk to the school is a massive hit to reputation. If the school was to be seen as not securing that data appropriately, they have to inform the community. Part of the responsibilities these days is a data breach notification process, which is mandated by the Australian government. So if data was to be compromised or even sent out accidentally by a user, for example, data exported into an Excel spreadsheet that perhaps shouldn't have been, and it gets emailed to someone, that constitutes a data breach. So not only do you have to report to the people affected about what's happened and how it's been, how it may have happened, but also you may have to report that to a government body as well. So it can be quite, I suppose, and we have seen it with schools recently in the last year as well in the media, where those cases have hit the media and caused a bit of reputational damage to those schools because there have been incidents in those areas. So it's certainly something that schools have to look towards to secure appropriately as best they can. And also, like I said, the training around making sure that that sensitive data is being handled really carefully.
Amazing. Are you hearing very similar sort of things, Simon?
Yeah, it's the reputational one obviously is a huge issue. But there was something that was brought up at another school that I was talking to a couple of months ago. One of the schools were talking about some previous students that they had that have gone on to become lawyers, judges, police, and so forth. Those details are still held on the school. So we're talking not so much about students per se anymore, but people that have got high position roles within our society where their names and address and details could still be held on file, which is quite an interesting piece that I hadn't really considered. There was one more thing as well, just to bring up. It's often mentioned in the media about the, not so much these days if you're going to get hit, but the when. And one of the things that I found more and more interesting is cyber preparedness for the when. So not so much, from a technical perspective, how one is prepared, or even from that reputational perspective, but how you respond to the media, to the authorities that Matthew was indicating. And for instance, the irony is schools have fire drills. I personally think they should be looking at cyber drills.
So just on that, Matt, is that something that you've built in as part of your practice? Do you have a cybersecurity policy that follows a set of instructions of what happens if you do get breached?
Yeah, so we do. So that's part of the what they call a data breach response plan, which is mandated by the government for organisations to have. And so that effectively outlines a number of steps around the process of identifying where the breach came from, what you do to take action to shut it down immediately, then into forming sort of a response group that may comprise various members of the leadership team. So it could be, if it's financial related, it might have a business manager involved. If it's compromising student data, it might have one of the student deputy principal roles involved. So that group would form and then respond accordingly based on what's outlined in that document. So there might be a statement that may need to be prepared. There may be reporting obligations that may need to happen to the government. So it really sets the guidelines. So that way, if you do have an incident, you can follow those steps calmly and not be sort of confused in the heat of the moment as to what to do and how to respond and what your obligations are. So they're really important. And then, of course, there's other policies around, I suppose, disaster recovery and things like that. If you were to have a system that's compromised and let's say hypothetically it gets ransomware and everything becomes encrypted, what do you do to restore that data and where has that data gone? So again, having sort of a playbook to respond to that is really important.
Okay, that's amazing information. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think I want to expand out the conversation now where you believe the greatest threats are and where you believe the schools can get the greatest return on investment. Not all schools are blessed with having the greatest of highest level of budget. So on Matt, I might go to you first. If you were coming into a new school, and let's just say it's a school with your average IT budget expenditure, where would you be looking to first to be able to protect the school for the greatest bang for buck?
So I suppose there's a couple of areas where I'd look at first. One would be backups, and I know you might be thinking why backups, but that would be to make sure that if something did happen to that data, whether it's a loss of some sort because a hacker might have got their hands on it, that you can actually recover the data in order to be able to identify what may have been leaked in particular. And then I'd probably start looking at two elements after that. One would be the firewall. I would look at, if you're hosting any services internally and they have public IP addresses that can be accessed to get direct access to, say, an on-premise server, what sort of ports are open and letting traffic in, and really trying to tightly control that and putting security on those virtual servers as well. And then the other element would be the user training. So working with the users to identify, do they know how to respond to a phishing email, making sure they don't click on unauthorized links, and then just generally making sure that their endpoint is secure. So making sure you've got an antivirus or endpoint solution product in place, making sure the users are protected by multi-platform authentication and conditional access. I think those are some really easy wins that perhaps might not be too difficult and perhaps may not be too expensive to sort of address first before you look at other areas which might be a bit more detailed.
Great. Simon, are you hearing similar sort of things out there?
Yeah, I was talking to a network manager the other day and he said to me, the easiest way to sort this out is just turn the internet off.
Great. Go back to the old library encyclopedias.
Absolutely, yeah. So, it'll give more business to Australia Post, obviously.
Yeah.
But no, I think, Matthew's obviously really hit on some of the key aspects. There's a couple of bits that I've discovered as well on the journey. And the first one, it sounds like I'm doing a pitch, but it's genuinely not. Whether you partner with us or whomever, but I genuinely believe now is a really great time to have that assessment done, to have a look at
cybersecurity assessment.
Absolutely. So I liken it to a house protection. It's where are your vulnerabilities, and I'm not talking about pen tests or anything like that. Because let's be honest, if you hire an ex-burglar, they'll tell you how to break in. They'll put a chair through the window. Ta-da, I'm in. All that does is tell you you've got a big hole in the window. So it's a much broader conversation to what Matthew was talking about risk, compliance, policies, procedures. It needs to be quite broad. And then that enables further conversations. I think other quick wins are looking at the licensing you've already got. So Microsoft 365, for instance, you've got Microsoft Defender in there from an endpoint perspective. And there's some schools that haven't yet applied that haven't done that because, it can be quite challenging. They've got already loads of BAU going off. And that leads me to another point. And again, it sounds like I'm being salesy, and I'm genuinely trying not to be. But from talking to a lot of schools, having security as a managed service makes a lot of sense to me. Because if you're looking at trying to do everything in-house, and I don't know what your thoughts on this, Matt, I'm sorry, I don't want to corner you into signing a contract with me right now, but respectfully, you've got X number of resources and X number of time. As soon as you start trying to have like a SIEM or a SOC on site and you're dedicating people to have eyes on screens and everything, a lot you can automate. But I would look at it this way, saying security is so important, why not hire a security company to look after your house, if we come back to that analogy, to make sure you're as secure as possible within a certain budgetary place. If you then have to go and hire your own security staff and then look after them and manage them, are they up to date with the latest threats and the rest of that? So I do think security is worth something looking at as kind of a living entity itself, and it needs to be looked after and managed professionally, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, actually, I think that the question I might ask you, Matt, in this is, I imagine the school and schools in general have got some sort of cybersecurity insurance policy that they've gone and invested in. Are those insurers challenging you to look at things like a cybersecurity service or understanding where the risk positions are of the schools?
But I suppose to answer that question, the cybersecurity insurance providers, for example, ours is through Catholic Church Insurance. A lot of them are starting to mandate particular that things need to be in place, otherwise they won't insure you. So things like multi-factor authentication are becoming baseline standards that you must meet, otherwise you're not insured. I suppose it depends on the insurance provider as to how much detail they go into and whether they audit the school, for example, prior to agreeing to insure. I'm not aware personally of anyone that has been audited to that extent, but certainly there are a lot of guidelines coming out that you need to meet X and Y criteria, or else you're not covered if you're liable, because they would see that as, if you don't have these systems in place, then you're being negligent.
Yeah, and I think if I was just going to add my own personal thoughts on that as well, I think what I've heard in market has been that there's obviously insurance that you can get if you've got these minimum requirements, but then there's obviously the ability to be able to reduce the premiums that you're having to incur if you start to add some of these extra features in. So there's a bit of a cost optimization there.
I see it almost exactly the same as household insurance. So if they ask, do you have lockable windows? Do you, how many locks do you have in your door? Blah, 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 blah. And I think, that it's exactly the same for me. And if I may, just one other point, just going on that same analogy is, and that's why I think security assessments going beyond how many locks do you have in your door, how many locks do you have in your window, it goes beyond that. So where do you hang your keys at night? Do you hang them where people can see them through the window? And this kind of sounds like I'm going off on a weird tangent. But from a cybersecurity perspective, is what are your processes? What are your protocols? Coming back to Matt's point about backups and disaster recovery, exploring beyond the how do you stop them getting in? It's like, well, once somebody unfortunately has broken into your house, how secure are things around the house so they don't find them that quickly and everything else?
Yep. So Matt, what about the student and the parent in this conversation, because they are obviously a potential attack vector for cyber criminals to use? How concerned are you about those sorts of elements of risk? And do you feel like that you've personally done enough in the school, but also the industry as a whole has done enough to be able to protect the students once they're outside the school network?
Yeah, really good question. I think to answer that, it will probably depend on the school's model of how they work with the students. So what I mean by that is, are you a school that provides one-to-one devices and manage them yourselves, or do students bring in their own devices? Now, from my experience, we've been a one-to-one managed program. So all our devices that we give the students come fully loaded with endpoint protection. They're not administrators on their device. All their email filtering goes through a cloud service. They can't run unauthorized executables and things like that. So from a perspective of the student themselves being compromised, I'm not really too concerned, and I don't see a lot of it. It does cause some other issues with managing the device at home, where they might want to install a printer and things like that, and they can't. But ultimately, it does provide a sense of security that when they come again to school the next day, they haven't gone home the night before and downloaded a piece of malware that might come into the network. So that's really helpful. Where you have to be careful is around monitoring traffic and things like that. So one thing we don't do is basically when the device is at home with the student and their parents that uses their internet connection. So it won't have the same level of firewall to say perhaps stop the students from browsing websites that they should. With that said, the protection in place on the device is enough that if they did click on something malicious, it fairly almost certainly won't be allowed to be executed. So that's just something we have to be aware of, and that's because of that grey area between, do you want to be managing a device 24 hours a day or only sort of during school hours? So being a school device, our approach is that we manage it so that way when it is at school, it's functional, and what happens outside of those hours is the parent's responsibility. Now, some parents are concerned about that. They do want either agents to be installed on the machine where they can monitor their child's traffic, and that's up to them. I suppose parents in BYOD programs might do very much a similar thing. So I guess the risk for a BYOD program, and you're bringing your own devices, is often parents may not have access to the same sort of level of security that schools can provide. Some of the tools that schools provide could cost a lot of money, and they're very good at securing those devices. Now, does the parent have access to that? Does the school have the ability to give them that software for their personal device? Those are all questions that may need to be answered by organisations in that position. So I think it's there's several approaches to it, and no one approach is perfect, but each have their pros and cons.
Awesome, thank you so much. All right, I just want to leave you guys the opportunity to sort of give our audience one little key takeaway from what you've spoken about today. So Simon, I'll go to you first. If you were gonna, if the audience was going to leave with one key point from today, where would you think that you'd send them? Understand your current position as clear as you can. Awesome, Matt.
Yeah, I'd say understand where your data's being kept, how you're managing it. I would say that's probably the most important takeaway in this discussion.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us, and thank you, audience, for tuning in to our fresh new season. I hope that you like the new format. We're going with video, we're going with virtual, we're trying all the different mediums, so I hope it resonates well. Thank you to you, Simon, for joining us. Thank you to you, Matthew, for investing the time. We do really appreciate it. Big shout out to St. Monica's College for allowing you to be a part of this as well. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Cheers, Dom. Thanks very much. See you later, Matt.